My name is Ann Collier. I'm the CEO of Arudia, a firm dedicated to improving culture, collaboration, and communication. Our methodology, or at our core, is that we give people insight and then the skills and the tools to be, outstanding leaders, managers, and team members. So with that, I am going to, let's see, it's 3 minutes after, which usually means that there'll be a few more people coming in, but we should have everybody in that's in the waiting room. Is that right, Cynthia? All right, awesome. Okay, so we're talking about a topic today about executive presence. So this is build your executive presence, and I'm really passionate about this because it's really about building your confidence, and in particular for women. And I see some men and women, but I actually had somebody reach out to me yesterday, a client from about 10 years ago who wanted to talk to me about building his executive presence. Executive presence is really important for your success, for your confidence, for your overall experience of your work and walking into new situations. So what I want to start with is when we're talking about executive presence, what are we talking about? And this slide was created from a study that was done in 2012 by American Express, Marie Claire Magazine, and Goldman Sachs to study what executive presence encompassed. So what we have learned from the 2012 study and then the 2022 study, which by the way has some really reflects some really interesting changes in what we view as executive presence, I think largely because of the pandemic and and having to work virtually. So I'll share that with you as well. But the upshot is that executive presence has three components. There is gravitas, communication, and appearance. So how you look, appearance, obviously, what you say, and how you behave. When we're talking about gravitas, we're talking about poise under pressure, decisiveness, and ability to project confidence. Communication is assertiveness, speaking skills, and the ability to read an audience or a situation. And appearance is about being polished and pulled together. And then an interesting add or shift in the 2022 report or research is that authenticity is actually very important too, and has supplanted some of the other aspects of executive presence. So when we talk about executive presence in the 2020s, we're really talking about someone who embodies inclusiveness, respects others, listens to learn, and again, that telegraphing authenticity. And I would say that a lot of this reflects a lot of the social changes that we've experienced. So the outcomes for today with that framework are that we're going to give you some tools for developing your executive presence. In particular, focus on how to help you project gravitas. And then I'm going to share a little bit about our leadership and management academy. When we talk about executive presence, having executive presence means that you're answering yes to this question, that you are in fact considered leadership to material. So what we're going to do today is rely on a leadership profile that's created by Dr. William Sparks called the Actualized Leader Profile. And obviously there's a framework there. And Dr. Sparks created the framework and researched it based on the work of four greats: Abraham Maslow, David McClellan, Carl Jung, and Viktor Frankl. So starting with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and many of you have probably seen this, the hierarchy. And the basic idea of the hierarchy is that you have to satisfy needs at one of the lower levels before you move on and even care about something at a higher level. So in other words, if you don't have food, water, and aren't getting sleep, you're not going to care so much about whether you love your job. So you've got, so again, you're like satisfying the needs at a lower level. And then you go to the next level and the next level. And the idea of being self-actualized, which is where Dr. Sparks pulled the name of the profile from, is that you're living to your highest potential. And what this doesn't mean that you're working the hardest, you're working nonstop. What it does mean is that you are finding your work fulfilling and you've got a fulfilling personal life. And so all the way around, there is satisfaction, challenge, and that you're basically, as I said, finding that your life is fulfilling. So that's Maslow's contribution to the framework. McClelland's contribution is a little bit different, and this is the motive drivers. So McClelland was voted one of the top 100 psychologists in the United States, and he identified that all humans are driven by affiliation with each other, power and control, and then achievement, which is about winning through technical expertise. From Carl Jung's work, and many of you may be familiar with this because of Kiersey-Bates temperament theory, or even more popularly, the Myers-Briggs type indicator, is that he's the first to have identified the shadow archetype, which is our emotional reactive side that's embedded in our subconscious, triggered by stress and fueled by negative emotions like fear, anger, and jealousy. So these are the times when we're not ourselves. And I've got that little character there in the gray, the shadow person or the shadow embodiment, but it can also appear as being conflict avoidant. And then lastly, Frankl's contribution is paradoxical intent and the idea that we experience what we fear. And so the reason that you're watching my little kitty Oscar running with a bag caught around his head is because about 6 or 7 months ago, he was inspecting a bag and got his head caught in the handle. And then, of course, he tried to back out of it. And when he could, and I tried to help him, but he just scared himself. So he couldn't get the bag off of him. So he decided he'd try to run away from it. And we all know how that works. And then so that darn bag was chasing him. So he ran harder and harder, and the bag kept chasing him. And so the point here is that the more that you run from something, the worse you make it for yourself and the worse outcome you create for yourself. So with that framework in mind, think about who you are as a leader. When we look at the executive presence, sort of the best leaders that we know is those who are highly self-actualized, meaning that they are not in that shadow side very often. We see this great balance or combination of being clear, decisive, communicating well, calm, patient, strategic, very curious, optimistic, good listeners, many of the things that you saw. And in fact, then when we look at executive presence, we've got many of those same things: the respect for others, the inclusivity, listening to learn. So again, that self-actualized leadership provides a really ideal and very helpful paradigm for understanding your own leadership style, your strengths, but then also what that shadow side looks like. And the reason the shadow side is so critical is because not being in your shadow, or being in your shadow, is going to destroy your executive presence. Staying out of it is obviously very, very positive and lends to having executive presence. So Dr. Sparks also, in his leadership research, identified these 9 attributes of actualized leaders. So you can see that I've got headings of thinking, feeling, and doing. So that's sort of the level or the domain. And then sequences, meaning the confidence sequence, the performance sequence, and the renewal sequence. And of course, objectivity here is the most important of the attributes. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. And in fact, Maslow says that objectivity is the most important. But to give you a brief overview of the 9 attributes, what we're talking about is leaders who are confident, perform well, and have a sense of renewal or well-being, are self-actualized, and have a high degree of executive presence. And if you look at each sequence more granularly, what you see is that people who are confident think objectively, feel courage, and speak with candor. People who perform well, they're able to hyper focus, which means thinking in a way that allows them to get really engrossed in their work. They trust their team and they find flow, meaning that they have uninterrupted time of working, and they really enjoy it. In other words, they kind of get lost in their work. And if things are going well, that's actually how it feels. Renewal is the thinking in that sequence is about optimal time orientation, which means being present most of the time, thinking about the past in a satisfied, sense, thinking about the future in a strategic, not stressed out or anxious way of feeling. Um, Acceptance is about self-acceptance, your strengths, weaknesses, the aging process, and solitude is about valuing, not avoiding time to yourself. So valuing, using that time for hobbies, to plan, that sort of thing. All right. So, and then there's real life, right? We all have all these demands on ourselves, and it's the demands and the stress and how you perform in these circumstances that either reinforce that you are leadership material, that you have executive presence, or that you aren't. And so when we talk about an actualized leader, we're talking about someone who thinks clearly and creatively about challenges, whilst instilling a sense of confidence that together the team will prevail. And that equals executive presence. When we talk about an actualized leader, we're talking about someone who elicits the willing and effective collaboration of others by effectively managing their own behavior under stress. And we're going to give you some key insights into that. So when we talk about the shadow side, we're talking about blaming, impatience, venting, over anxious, the worrying, the negativity. These are the things that eat away at your executive presence. And like, if you just pause and you think about the people that you've worked with that you're like, yeah, that's a great leader. They do not do any of these things. They may poke a little fun at something going wrong, but that's not negativity. They may be thoughtful about how to proceed, but that's not obsessiveness. And certainly the blaming, which is a place that, Cynthia and I spend a lot of our time coaching, is to make sure that is to help our clients talk about challenges, because things go wrong in the workplace all the time and in life. Talk in a way that does not project blame on other or on oneself or others. All right. So again, we don't like blaming. And of course, the key here is to remember that, just like that little bag following Oscar, we want to make sure that we're not creating exactly what we were trying to avoid. So what we want to do right now is to share, have you identify what your primary motive driver is. We all have these three, but at different strengths. So what you can do is go to alpfree.com/Arudia, and Cynthia will put that in the chat as well. And have you take that. And if you've done the full assessment with us, you can most definitely just use your report. You have a more robust picture of your leadership style. Okay. I'm just going to give you a moment here. And then Cynthia, would you be willing to put the worksheet in the chat as well? All right, I'm going to let you wrap that up as I show you. So if you are an affirmer, then meaning that this is your primary leadership style. What you've got on the left in the red is when you're at your best: friendly, empathetic, loyal, helpful, and generous. And what you've got on your right is at your worst when you're triggered by your shadow fear of rejection. I'm going to go a little bit more into that and what that, but you have this, and you can share this free assessment with anybody. But it's the conflict avoidance, indecision, dependence, overly accommodating, and jealous. If you were to take the full profile, and I know some of you have, what you'll see is you'll get your score, and that's or your strength. And that's the gray bar graphs, which actually correspond to that infographic. You can see, for example, that this person is an intense affirmer, moderate asserter, and mild achiever. There's no ideal place to be on this, although it is better to be more intensely self-actualized rather than mildly self-actualized. But again, we just show this to you as a sample of what the full report would look like. All right, so with that, what I want to do, and by the way, going back to this slide for a moment, you either got a red screen, which is the affirmer, a blue screen, which is the asserter, and a green screen, which is the achiever. But the point I'm trying to make with this slide is that all of us are affirmers, asserters, and achievers, just to at greater strengths or lesser strengths. So let's take a look at the first leadership style. So when we talk about affirmers, we're talking about people who are people driven. They're driven to affiliate, to connect. They're people. They're empathetic. They are relationship focused. And Angie, you still have your hand. Oh, does anybody have any questions, by the way? Okay. All right. Good. Just pausing there for a moment. And affirmers are, friendly, generous, loyal, empathetic. They're kind. They're helpful. They tend to accept others. They want to trust their colleagues. And they're about relationships and connections. And they also tend to be very loyal. Affirmers tend to have good emotional intelligence and really good interpersonal skills and make excellent listeners. So note here that in the 2022 study, being an excellent listener, caring about others, being authentic, sort of an affirmer sort of score. And Angie, do you have a question? Sorry, your hand is up.
Oh, I was trying to lower it because you had said it was up. So sorry, I was looking at the documents. Thank you.
Okay,
it's down.
No problem. I have the same trouble, by the way. I just want to make sure. Okay. So, and affirmers they make great teammates because they have a natural concern for others, loyal, effective team members. They notice and are concerned about others' well-being. And again, they like working on teams because they like to support others. They have respect for others. They want to have authentic relationships, and they tend to have good skills around listening to learn and being inclusive. So notice how the drive to connect, the drive to affiliate shows up as executive presence, or in the new way of thinking about executive presence. All right, so that's a very short summary of that aspect of your leadership style. So we're going to quickly look at the shadow side. So this slide, it may not be my prettiest, no good cartoons, but it does share some important information, and that is that it connects functional IQ to level of cognition to mental state and sphere of concern. Importantly, noting that when you're calm, so when you're not stressed, your functional IQ is pretty high, and your concern is for yourself and for others. And when you're really stressed out, so when you're over in the red, your functional IQ, your ability to solve problems, to think abstractly, declines precipitously. You're driven by fear, just like little Oscar running with that bag stuck on his head. And yourself and your bodily integrity, you're just worried about your own personal safety. So car is, you're in the path of a speeding car. Your only focus is to jump out of the way, as it should be. But translate all of that table into the workplace, and think about what happens when everybody on a team is really stressed out. It's hard to think their way out of the problem that is stressing them out. And then importantly, as I said, this idea of the shadow side and managing the shadow. So that's what we want to talk about here, is how the shadow derails our potential to be considered for leadership or management positions or promotion or being taken seriously or respected, because we are acting in our shadow. So the way to manage this is to, and this is in the handout, but you of course can take just a piece of paper, is to go to page 147 in the handout. And this is a section out of our workbook. I promise this worksheet is not 147 or 150 pages long. It's probably about 13. So just jot down on a piece of paper what it is that stresses you out, like just a few stressors. I just wrote an article on dealing with strong negative emotional responses. And so for some of them, and I wrote it actually because I have a number of clients who really struggle to deal with their own clients. These are lawyers, own clients who are incredibly negative. So I shorten strong negative emotional responses to a sneer. So when we have clients or people who are, constant sneerers, it's pretty unpleasant. And for affirmers, by the way, it can be very, very difficult. So, so now that you've identified your leadership style, your primary leadership style, and some of the things that stress you out, I want to take a look at more deeply into the shadow side. So remember, affiliation, affirmers are about relationships. And so the shadow side of this is fear of rejection. So triggers for this shadow are anything that suggests the relationship is broken or not intact. Prospect of conflict, hurting somebody else's feelings, making them angry, that kind of thing. This table is on page 148 in the worksheet, by the way. So again, remember that affirmers, like at our best, this shows up actually on your test result as well. If you get the red screen, at your best, friendly, generous, loyal, empathetic, and helpful. But when you are driven by fear, so again, think about, that bag chasing, your cat or dog. The more you run away from it, the worse it gets. When you're conflict avoidant, trying to avoid hurting somebody's feelings, making somebody else angry, or even being angry at somebody else, you have that sort of constellation of thinking, feeling, and behaving, right? The feeling sensitive and insecure and indecisive. By the way, those three plus feeling anxious, when I'm worried about what somebody thinks about me or about the relationship, are kind of my top four. The naivete, people ask a lot about that, is really about not believing that somebody is really taking advantage of you, right? Kind of oh no, they're not doing that. We're good friends. Like, no, they're stabbing you in the back, that kind of thing. So, and then, but there's a shadow side to that too. So you don't want to always believe that somebody has negative intentions. In fact, a client shared this with me recently about how often incompetence or lack of communication is mistaken for intentional behavior. And in our coaching, we definitely see that's true. So the idea here of the shadow is that, for every positive drive, there is a shadow side. And so the story that I always share about this, it's a personal example, but I think it drives home the point. And that is that probably about 6 or 7 years ago, I was talking to my Aunt Susie, and I found out that my parents were having a family reunion. And obviously I didn't know about it, so it was clear that I was not invited. And then I called my parents, and my father told me that my sister had said if I was there, she wasn't going to come, and she wasn't going to bring the only grandchildren. So the family response, or the family solution to this, was to have this reunion, but not include me and not tell me either. Now, for those of you who have siblings or have more than one child, sibling rivalry is a real thing. And I'm just going to tell you, being 50 years old and being worried that your parents love your sister more than you is downright embarrassing, as my husband pointed out several times. Um, and so here's the thing. This is not easy. I do this work for a living, and I have for the last 20, 22 years. And I was caught up in my shadow. I knew I was caught in my shadow. And but I was really struggling to navigate my way out of it. I like I said, I intellectually knew. My husband, who is the voice of reason, who has a very, very low affirmer drive, kept telling me, my parents are conflict avoidant. They're on a glide path. They'll do anything to make my sister feel good about herself. It doesn't reflect me, not to worry. I knew all that to be true, but it wasn't until what I understood and what I got was that, I was making the test that I was either loved or rejected. That's easy. And by the way, when you're in your shadow, there's all sorts of evidence about how right you are, about how bad the situation is, or how you've been wronged. But when my eye focused on this very slide on the word rejection, I got it. The test was not, am I loved or rejected? It was much more nuanced. It was exactly what my husband said, which was that, my parents are conflict avoidant. Of course, they love me. And even if they didn't, who cares? I mean, that tells you a lot about him. But the point really is that when you get out of your shadow, like, you're doing it for yourself. I mean, you're doing it for the people around you, but it is miserable being in your shadow. And you have the power to choose one way or another, whether you're in your shadow or not. So, the point here is that for an affirmer, or to recognize that when somebody else is in their shadow, so we're going to get to the shadows that sort of led to this whole crazy family thing. But when somebody else is in their shadow, that's not about you. That's about their choice to be in their shadow rather than not. But the unfortunate thing for us affirmers is that everything feels personal. Okay, so again, nothing is personal, but it all feels personal. And this is not about telling you just to have a thicker skin, but it really is about changing the way that you think about what just happened so that you are empowered in navigating through it. That is the point that I'm hoping to make here. And so, all right, so what does this have to do with executive presence? So first of all, being conflict avoidant, not being able to have candid conversations, that is completely inconsistent with executive presence. So the shadow side detracts from your presence and from your leadership. The other side of this, the empowered when you're at your best, when you're not in your shadow, that's all very consistent with executive presence. So just to share with you the fear of rejection shadow cycle, thinking I can't be alone, feeling insecure, ignoring your own needs, being overly accommodating, saying that other needs are more important than your own, feeling insignificant, doing things for others before asked and potentially when not necessary, thinking you shouldn't anger others, feeling weak, and avoiding conflict and staying in unhealthy relationships. I mean, I do think about the fact that in high school, I should have broken up with my high school boyfriend like 2 years before I did, but lesson learned there. Um, so there is that. And then here's the other piece about this, about our paradoxical intent, is that the more conflict avoidant we are, the worse we make it. So we bring that conflict to us. How many times have you either heard or you yourself been upset that somebody's frustrated, or, I can't believe that, my family member, friend, colleague, peer didn't tell me X. Like, just tell me what it is. The shadow gets in the way. The shadow eats away at your executive presence. So here's another way to quickly think about it is, when we're, and this is, I think, useful, is when we're stressed, we're in what we call an amygdala hijack mode. We're like, running away from the saber-toothed tiger or jumping out of the way of the speeding car. And so we're reactive. And what you want to do is develop the skills to assess, like, okay, and this is why you have that list and you do the work. You want to develop the skills to identify, all right, you know what, whenever I work with this particular client or this particular colleague, I always feel judged and I'm stressed. Or I worry about X, Y, and Z, and it makes me stressed. And then I'm in one of the three or all of the three shadows. Just thinking about it moves your thinking to the prefrontal cortex, which then kind of reduces your anxiety and your stress about this. So even if you're in your shadow a little bit, you're not in your deepest, darkest shadow. So you're more effective. And the point here is to give you the tools to be able to choose objectivity. Remember, Maslow says objectivity is the most important of the attributes of actualized leaders. And then Will Sparks put together the framework, and this is the most important attribute as well, but also it grounds the whole confidence. So when we think about executive presence, the ability to project confidence, it's squarely grounded in this work. So I'm just going to share some shadow examples, and please do ask questions. I'm here for you today, and so is Cynthia. So you'll notice other people are in their shadow when they complain about not being appreciated, when they're paralyzed because somebody doesn't like them, or their manager doesn't have time with them, when they're anxious or indecisive or not asking for guidance or able to reveal a mistake. That I don't want to let somebody down. I don't want to get yelled at, that kind of thing. And the antidote is really about connection. All right. So since we're talking about leadership and we're talking about executive presence, we do a lot of work on culture. So I just want to share with you that an actualized leader impact on culture is you have a friendly, inclusive, supportive community where people talk about the real issues and they deal with them. When you have a lot of shadow, you end up with sort of an underlying emotionality of frustration and despair, because basically people don't want to deal with the hardest issues. Differences are smoothed over rather than dealt with. But there's a lot of talking at the proverbial water cooler. There's a lot of gossip, but there's a lack of direct communication. There's triangulation because this shadow leads to not dealing with issues squarely. So again, going back to the attributes of someone with executive presence, being decisive, dealing with issues, staying calm, you're seeing how the shadow kind of interferes with that. And my tip here for you affirmers, or for all of us, is always to ask for feedback. Make it easy for people to tell you, where the opportunities for improvement are. That's one of and give feedback as well. All right, so this is for all of us, but especially for those of you who got the blue screen. Asserters are results driven, so it's about power and control, but it's about the power to and independence to drive and control results. Kind of that driven to produce, bias for action. Asserters are assertive, most clearly. And, I would connect this to gravitas, the being taken seriously. The, person who is gravitas, you sort of know what that means. You walk into a room, people pay attention, they're respected, all of that. Again, really, that's the most important. While gravitas is the most important in terms of contributing to executive presence, I won't leave out the fact that appearance is really important, because that's the first impression and you don't get a second chance at that. So asserters, often viewed as natural leaders with that take charge attitude. They're dynamic, enthusiastic, candid, and direct. They tend to be very confident, bold, decisive, willing to take risks. They are definitely slow to trust and skeptical, and they like to challenge the status quo. So if I go back to this idea of trust, affirmers want to trust their colleagues because that's part of having a good relationship. And asserters, and then the last of the three, the achievers, struggle with trust. Asserters struggle with giving up control, especially in their shadow. When you talk about strategy and negotiation, that's where that part of what we do, it all comes from our drive for power and control to drive results. And I would also add that asserters are rational, objective, analytical, critical thinkers, focused, hardworking, and they like to solve complex problems. So that's all fantastic. And so when they're empowered and at their best, that confident, decisive, competitive, candid, and courageous. But when they're in their fear of betrayal shadow, which can be triggered by anything that smacks of lack of control or vulnerability or concern about not being able to achieve the results, you've got behaviors that are, all the behaviors are counterproductive, but what I would say is, that sort of the arrogance, the trying to push too hard. So remembering that the challenge for asserters is that pushing for results does not equal pushing people. And what I would also add to that is that asserters are very much, they just care about getting it done. And that's the piece that gets lost in this, because when you see those behaviors, you sort of attribute that, the person is difficult, they can't control their stress, any other number of not very nice things that can be said about this person. Impatience, like we've all been impatient. I mean, I can ask you, but I know everybody should be raising their hand about whether they've ever been impatient. And what I mean by that, and I want you to look at it now through the lens of this shadow, is that if you are impatient, it's because you're wanting to get something done, but you're chafing against the idea that you can get, that you're going to be able to get it done, that you're going to be able to get the result on time. Impatience shows up in a number of ways. For example, it shows up as, making decisions without others when you should coordinate, the obvious ways, leaving people off communication, doing things, being a little bit impulsive, like I said, pushing too hard. The other things, notice they're all about trying to push people, including the manipulation, to get things the way that you want them. So when I look at the fear of betrayal shadow cycle, we're looking at, having to be in charge because feeling insecure, maneuvering for power or control, thinking people can't be trusted, feeling skeptical, rarely putting down your guard or expressing vulnerability, having to be right, feeling arrogant, being outspoken, autocratic, and sarcastic to mask fear, not being in control. Betrayal, it's betrayal in the way that we think about it, but also betrayal of results or not getting the results. So in the workplace, what we tend to see is, maneuvering to cut somebody out, impatience, the yelling, the all caps, interrupting and dismissing others' views publicly, bullying, intimidating others on, meetings or calls, or dominating the conversations, making decisions without including. So if you're working with somebody who's in this shadow, our recommendation is that you assure them that everything is under control. Now, notice how all of this gets in the way of your executive presence. This is the opposite of listening to others, listening to learn, all of the things that kind of came up in the most recent study, respect. I mean, that shadow is, kind of smacks of disrespect. Listening to learn, there's not that going on there. Nor does it feel inclusive. I mean, essentially this shadow results in people trying to hide from it, right? And you can see how that comes up culturally. So when you have an actualized asserter, interdependent, risk reward, take charge, progress, strategic, and fearless. But the shadow side of that creates a culture where there's some fear and anxiety. The bottom line being that people are afraid to volunteer for tasks or ask questions and or challenge solutions. So, you lose a lot of intellectual and problem-solving horsepower if you're not if you're making people too afraid to raise their hand. And then lastly, we've got achievers. So achievers are driven by achievement, which is about winning through technical expertise, doing everything perfectly. We all have some amount of this. Achievers tend to be very committed to technically accurate results. Whoops, hold on. I think I accidentally hit the backslide. Sorry about that. Okay. The back button. All right. So serious about their work, you want to be serious with them, just tell them what it is. And they don't like a lot of chit chat, very like to work independently, which because they're doing such detail work, you sort of need to have them let them do. Committed to results, dependable, organized, and responsible. Very much expertise driven and, focused on doing the task exactly right, exactly in the right way. So sometimes in the stress side of this, you'll see a lack of flexibility, but it's about winning through that deep technical expertise, developing the technical expertise, and thriving on accomplishment. So achievers tend to be very high individual achievers, driven, focused, competent, controlled, excellent planners. So there's the plan, the backup plan, and then a few backup plans to that backup plan. Achievers require concrete feedback. They tend to be risk averse because remember, they want their original plan to go right. And they can be perfectionists both in a good way and in the shadow side in sort of a maladaptive way. Very much focused on expertise and competence. They're serious about their work. As I said, independent, dependable, organized, responsible, committed to results, and very much prefer consistency and predictability, as well as being very detail-oriented, discipline-focused, and rules-oriented. Now, the shadow side of that, you've already probably guessed, is sort of an extreme version of all those positive attributes, like an extreme negative version, right? So very detailed, organized, structured, thorough, and serious. The shadow side of that sort of falls for me into 3 buckets. So this, analysis paralysis, I can't make a decision because I haven't figured out all the details. Then there's the sticking with the plan, even though the plan has no, kind of doesn't make any sense. And then there's the negativity, that bottom right-hand corner, stubbornness, argumentative, critical, and pessimistic. The basic, this shadow is grounded in scarcity, but I would also say that, and the prospect of losing or imperfection or ambiguity is also very, very triggering. So a project, and think about the beginning of the pandemic, nobody knew what it was, nobody knew how to do anything. And so, and it was very stress inducing and shadow inducing, right? So, and I like to think about this shadow as being this kind of mindset, like we've done one thing wrong. We've pulled one card out from the house of cards and the whole thing collapses. And, when we look at it in terms of the thinking, feeling, acting shadow cycle, the thinking I have to be perfect, feeling inadequate, becoming nitpicky and obsessive. No one else can do it as well as I can, feeling frustrated and being overly critical and micromanaging. I am not enough, having to earn love, feeling worthless, taking on too many projects and staying overscheduled and overcommitted. So when we look at the examples here, it's things like never accepting somebody else's work, constant revisions that don't really improve, obsessing over emails or anything written, replaying conversations over and over again, including concluding disaster, complaining about staff, rarely delegating, saying that others aren't good enough. So the antidote here is abundance. And what I mean by that is really just tuning, as Wayne Dwyer would say, tuning into this idea that we have enough. We have enough time, we have enough resources, we don't have to get it perfect on the first time out of the box. And so what we have here when we look at the impact on culture is, where you have positive, the self-actualized achiever, you've got people take ownership, accountability, they're serious, they deliver. When you've got the negative sides or the shadow side of the achiever, you've got anger and apathy. I mean, and this culture, by the way, also captures everything else that might be going on in the, in the broader organization or in the environment. So we saw a lot of detached when we at the beginning of the, kind of little wait. Well, once people figured out the pandemic wasn't just going away, and they had to adjust, they started doing workshops again, and we saw a lot of detached, and that makes sense for a number of reasons. One, people were angry, they were scared. They were worried, very, very worried. So that will show up here. So on page 148 in the handout that we shared with you, you've got these three tables. And what I encourage you to do is go back to your what you identified as stressors and figure out which shadows are triggered and what the first signs are that you are in that particular shadow, knowing, of course, that you can be in one or more shadow at a time. I also want you to think about in terms of solutions to tap into the 9 attributes. So also in your handout on page 150, you've got a table with these attributes with a definition and with some tips. So when I want to share with you before we wrap up, just some tips for staying out of your shadow and having more executive presence. So first of all, it really is about staying out of blame. So be a system thinker, not a blamer of people. So if something's not working, focus on, hey, you know what, the way we're working, we need a better system of communication, of communicating deadlines, that kind of thing. Our win-win conversation model has as its first step using neutral, non-pejorative language and being concise. And at the basis of that model is, in fact, the idea of having a solution-focused mindset. Because when you're focused on blame, all that energy is spent on blaming rather than on coming up with a solution. And, thinking about it's not you, it's not me, it's our system. That's actually a title of an article that I wrote on developing good systems for working together. Part of it is that you've got to remember to create the system. And if the system is broken, just to focus on the system and get buy-in from the other people in the system. In terms of staying out of that asserter shadow, making sure that you're clarifying decision-making criteria and involving everybody and being clear who has the D. And if I didn't adequately link the shadow side of both the asserter and the achiever shadow, my apologies. For the asserter, that behavior that's like slightly bullying or intimidating or impatient, that is the opposite of having executive presence. And similarly with the achiever shadow, the micromanaging is not, and the stress and the negativity, again, not executive presence. Think objectively, speak candidly. That helps you create security as you all move forward. And of course, this is directed to the strong and intense affirmers in the group. Make it safe to raise concerns. This is especially true for the asserters and the achiever. And create security with honesty. Those are the affirmers. In particular, during the pandemic, I heard from a lot of more junior lawyers that they didn't know if they were doing well, and not having any feedback is difficult. And you have to actually accept no, counters, offers, and negotiation when you ask for a task to be done. I mean, that's sort of, so in other words, the yes means something in your communication. This also means that you need to, as a leader, ruthlessly prioritize. And, something's going to not get done, and you might as well decide what that is and avoid sort of Pollyannic cheerleading, because then people don't feel like they can be candid about the fact that, their workload might be overwhelming. If you've said something that is problematic, clean it up. We all make mistakes, say things we either regret or came out in a way that we didn't intend. Keep your word, which also means that if you can't deliver when you said you would, let the person know ahead of time rather than have them chase you down. Go from overwhelmed to done. Oh, sorry, I jumped a tip. Um, be objective by being mindful. So just remember, curiosity is the antidote to the shadow. If somebody's really upset with you, and this is one of my recommendations in that article about sneers, is just listen for what's really going on, ignore the pot shots, and try to get everybody focused on the solution. Be a unitasker. Multitasking is really not good. It's when we make our worst mistakes. You can multi-switch, but don't kid yourself that you can multitask. Hone your authentic listening, which again is important to executive presence by focusing and being fully present, listening for shadows, and then use coaching skills, which we share within our academy, as well as we'll do another free program on that, I'm sure, and then in the fall. Decide that decided is done. You've got to, if you keep going back in that, like, kind of in that achiever shadow sort of way of thinking about your work, worrying about every little thing, that is completely counterproductive. So have a system that you trust. Do it. It's a little bit like proofreading an article. I try to do it after I've had a good night's sleep, first thing in the morning, and then submit it. I don't read it 10 times in the same day, because I'm reading over things for sure. So this is on page, I think it's 146 in your handout, or actually, I don't think this table is, but the upshot is that, there's a lot that you can do to improve your self-actualization. And if you look at that self-actualization column on the far right, it's the beauty of the end. It's being able to, all the positive things about being self-actualized, about the strengths, but also then the self-actualized, the opposite of the shadow side. And then, of course, when we talk about creating a culture that we want, it's a culture in which passion and authenticity reign. So it's open and honest, direct communication, being objective and responsible. Everybody's objective and responsible for their work, realistic, optimistic. We use coaching skills, and I'm just looking at the time here. I'm actually going to jump ahead. I'm going to jump actually to the very end just to share about our Leadership Academy. I had a couple of more things, but I just really would like to hear also if you have any questions or comments about the material before we wrap up and say goodbye for the day. All right, anybody?
It was a really good refresher. I really liked kind of the shadow side of things, and kind of see, it just raises your awareness to maybe those blind spots or things, what's kind of going on behind you. Really found it helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So the full actualized leader profile we use it in our Leadership Academy. And then so we do a debrief over 2 sessions. So it's 3 hours of training. And again, you get your own report. But then most of our Leadership Academy monthly webinars have some component of staying in that self-actualized place. So I just invite you to, that if you're interested in investing in your leadership, is to consider our Leadership Academy. there's a Friends 15 off for special pricing. And if you're at a nonprofit, please just reach out to us, and we have very special pricing for that. Anyway, anybody else care to share what they found most useful about this? All right. Well, I just want to thank you again for your time, and thank you. And we are going to send out a recording, and we'll send out the handout again so you can see that. And again, I thank you so much for your time and attention today. And we're not quite at the 4th of July, but enjoy the very long weekend and take good care. Bye-bye.